Can I just say one thing firstly? I love the name Eat, Sleep, Boxing, Repeat.
Welcome back to ESBR Boxing's YouTube channel. Delighted to be joined by Danny and Paul in partnership with sharpbetting.co.uk. Please click the link in the description to get your betting tips and analysis, not just for boxing, but for other sports as well, horse racing, football. Yeah, they cover up quite a lot there, so please do check them out. This is the big fight breakdown video for the big fight of the year between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn, taking place at the Tottenham Hotspur Football Stadium on April the 26th. Gents, good to be joined, both of you. We've had 2.5 years to kind of, I suppose, think about this fight and give our predictions and say what we've got to say about it. But yeah, we're finally here. The fight is finally happening, and I'm looking forward to breaking it down with both of you. Danny, cast your mind back 2.5 years. I don't know if you can go that far back nowadays, but we're all there, weren't we? I think it was what, 3 days before the fight was supposed to happen. Fight gets called off due to Conor Benn failing two drugs tests. What would have happened that night, in your opinion? Chris Eubank had to come down to that catch weight. You had that picture of him looking quite kind of frail and ill. Whereas Conor Benn was kind of maybe even more untried than he is now. What would have happened 2.5 years ago, Danny?
It's interesting because I remember thinking at the time that I thought Eubank would smash him to bits, but as time goes on, you wonder how much would that weight cut and that subsequent rehydration clause, how much of an effect would that have had on Eubank? By all accounts, even getting down close to that weight really hampered him months later when he fought Liam Smith for the first time. So it's maybe not as much of a foregone conclusion as I thought. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Ben would have got to him. Like, I'm really still sort of mulling over my prediction for this fight. Obviously, time's gone on. As fighters get older, the weight cut takes more and more out of them. But, judging by how poor and how brittle and how sort of, I don't know, vulnerable Eubank looked in the fight with Liam Smith, you really wonder how much would those extra few pounds being depleted with, what was it, a £10 rehydration clause even back then, how much an effect would that taken out of them? So yeah, an interesting one. Maybe Ben would have got to him early.
Yeah, no, it would have been really interesting. I think. I just think I think that catch weight would have had a big factor in things. Paul, it's kind of irrelevant now, isn't it? But what do you think would have happened?
Yeah, I think you make good points. I think that with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what happened with Eubank after that, again in the first Liam Smith fight, and so on and so forth, you maybe are going here. Hold on, actually, I can see where Danny's coming from. Maybe Ben would have caught him. I would have been. I always thought that Eubank would have won that fight. Um, Perhaps still do. We'll come on to that at the end. But I mean, I think 2.5 years ago, October 2022, I would have. Yes, Ben was on that run, I suppose, kind of that knockout streak of Chris Algieri, the Samuel Vargas, like kind of really was looking quite good. Um, but at that time, still thought that Eubank had this unbreakable chin, which he had shown as well. I'd never even really been remotely hurt, I suppose, any time in a fight. Yes, now we can look back at it and think that rehydration did not do him any favors, even in months down the line, as Danny alluded to. But I still would have felt that Chris Eubank Jr. had enough to win that fight on the night. So yeah, it'll be interesting that we are getting it 2.5 years down the line, and to see how many people's opinions have changed. Because I'd say it's probably a lot closer in people's eyes now than it would have been 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, really interesting, and it's one of those that we'll never know what would have happened 2.5 years ago. And I think another factor is that before there was a catch weight, now there's not. This fight's at middleweight, but how well does Chris Eubank Jr. make middleweight in 2025? We'll have to see. Paul, I'll stick with you. What does the future look like for both fighters? Chris Eubank Jr., 35 years old now. I feel like he's maybe a bit of an unpredictable fighter. With kind of who he's going to face. He's kind of He's never won a world title, despite having kind of fought for a world title and discussing world titles. Yeah, just tell me without giving your prediction away, what does it look like? You've got Conor Benn, who sounded like he was in talks to fight for the WBC world title against Mario Barrios instead of Eubank Jr. For the next year or so, what does the future look like for both fighters?
I think if you're Eubank, it ultimately depends on the result on April 26th. I think if he's, for argument's sake, stopped, whether or not there would be a rematch or whatever. But I think if you're getting stopped by Conor Benn, you need to. I think he could probably hang them up, to be honest, even from a pride point of view. Um, if he's to win, I'd say obviously he's a prize fighter at the end of the day, so he'll want to make the most money again. Whether that would be a rematch or not, I could see him fight for another version of the world title. Whether or not he could actually win a world title middleweight, whether or not he fights Canelo, whether that's something he wants to do up at maybe 168. But again, he might have to wait his turn depending on what happens with Canelo, if he's going to fight Crawford, and then if he was going to go maybe down the Bivol route or whatever. And then similarly for Benn, I think if he loses, it's not as detrimental because he could reel out the I'm a welterweight, blah 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 blah. This was just a big money fight that I couldn't turn down. Legacy. He'll go back to welterweight or light middle, whatever. Kind of continue his career there. If he wins, though, I mean, so if he wins, is there going to be a rematch? Probably, but I couldn't see him continuing the campaign at middleweight anyway. I would see him probably going back down, maybe not welterweight, but maybe super welter, and trying to win world honors there.
Do you think Conor Benn will win a world title?
No, man, I don't believe so.
Fair enough. All right, Danny. It's a bit of an open question, but yeah, where do you see the next year or so going for both fighters' career? Eubank Jr. could retire if he loses to Conor Benn. But yeah, I'll hand things over to you now. What do you see happening in the next year or so for both?
I think regardless of who actually wins, I think if we see a competitive fight the first time around, we'll see it again because it'll still be the biggest fight for both. In saying that, I do think there's a world where Eubank retires. I mean, if he's stopped in one-sided fashion and there's no real appetite for the rematch, I mean, what's the weight going to be at a rematch if that's the excuse they wheel out? And it's probably a big enough payday that he would be content in that side of things. I mean, he doesn't seem particularly keen on, winning a world title. So I think there is a world where he retires. I think Benn, as Paul says, it's not as nowhere near as much of a setback. If Benn was to lose, he can go down to welterweight or 154 or whatever and have a rebuild. I mean, he's only 27, 28. He'll be even fresher than that given the time he's had out of the ring. And yeah, I don't think it's anywhere near as much of a setback. But I do think in the balance of probabilities, a rematch, maybe even a third fight is the most likely, especially if there's a bit of controversy in the first one. Can you imagine how big a rematch would be if there was a contentious scorecard or a premature stoppage? I mean, it would be bigger than Froch Groves too, really. So yeah, I think obviously it's not a foregone conclusion. I mean, either fighter could potentially win in one-sided fashion. It's one of those fights where you couldn't rule that out. But I think in all likelihood, a second fight is probably most likely.
Yeah, and I think, in my opinion, for Eubank Jr., the ideal scenario here is that he wins and there's a rematch because he wins the fight. It's another massive payday. And I think if he wins the first fight, he'll probably fancy himself to win a rematch. And I'm not sure what other kind of realistic super fights there are out there for Eubank Jr. that kind of meets his appetite when it comes to money. Danny, we'll stick with you. Just another couple more questions from me before we go into predictions, gents. How past his best is Eubank in your opinion? 35 years old now. He had that loss to Liam Smith a while ago, but of course came back and dominated the rematch. Had a year out the ring before fighting Kamil Zarameta. It's maybe a tricky question because he's not been that active. But how past his best do you think this guy is?
I'd say he's a fair bit past it, to be honest. I think he's obviously changed his style over the last, what you would say, maybe 3-4 years, but I think he probably needed to. I think we would have seen Chris Eubank Jr. beat and stopped earlier than we did if he fought the way he used to fight. I mean, the best version of Eubank was probably around the time that beat James DeGale. I mean, he's got some good wins back then, like maybe no standout world level fighters in their prime, but still some solid wins. I've never been overly sold by this sort of counter-punching back foot version of Eubank, but I do think it's maybe a change he had to make. I think his best attributes were always his chin, his fitness, his punch output. I mean, he has got a level of power, but I don't think he's got, one punch knockout power at the top level. I mean, Liam Smith was sort of stopped on his feet and he was a sitting duck that fight for him, wasn't he? So I do think his best years are quite a way behind him, to be honest.
Yeah, look, he's had an interesting career, and it's interesting to talk about it because he's had really good periods, but I think you could also say about Eubank Jr. when he's gone to a certain level, he's lost in regards to his fights against Billy Joe Saunders and George Groves. However, both of those fights were a long time ago now. Paul, what's your opinion on this? Eubank Jr. Had that loss to Liam Smith, which maybe he was doing well in that fight until the stoppage happened. But where do you see his career? Could he fight for another 3, 4 years after this? Do you think he's at the end now? Where do you think he's at?
I definitely do think he's past his best. Maybe not as much as maybe Danny's saying. I do agree with in the sense of if you're looking at prime, it was the De Gale one a prime win, but then you're also thinking, did that flatter him? Was that a De Gale on his way out? It's hard to judge really. And like as you said, excuse me, even look at the defeats, like the Groves defeat. Yes, he got beat there and he was well beaten, but like he did win a few rounds. He did give Groves make him answer a few questions, but ultimately got beat. Some of his best, he has been around for quite a long time, Chris Eubank Jr. When you actually look at it, I mean, I do believe he's past his best. Whether or not he still has enough past his best to be Conor Benn, well, we'll find out, and that's the really intriguing thing here as well for me. But I'd say I agree with Danny. I do believe he is past his best, maybe a few fights. And I don't think the level of inactivity helped him as well. But then I think the Sarah Meta fight, I think we're going to see a better version of Eubank than that. Because I think that was a long time out of the ring, far too long, and he didn't look great. Well, particularly from the midway onwards, maybe. But I think there were a few hairy moments in there as well. So I do think he's past his best. I think maybe his chin isn't what it was. His punch out bit isn't what it was. He's still obviously incredibly fit, but I just think he's maybe in every department got a little bit worse. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Look, we'll find out, won't we? On April 26th, he's going to have someone much younger than him, much fresher than him, putting pressure on him. And we'll see kind of how his chin holds up as well. All right, chaps, it's that time. As always, look, we've got a couple of weeks until the fight now, so predictions change. The weigh-in is going to be really interesting for this one, isn't it? With what's Conor Benn going to look like? Middleweight, is he going to weigh in at 160 pounds? Will he weigh in light? That's really interesting as well. And then on the other side, how easy does Eubank Jr. make that weight now? What does he look like? Who am I going to go to first? Danny, going to go to you first. Couple of weeks out, what is your prediction for Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn, please?
I actually think Conor Ben's going to stop him relatively early as well. I think Eubank's capable of stopping Ben. I think there's still question marks over Ben's chin. Has been ever since the first Cedric Payne fight. However, I think Ben's a lot more explosive than Chris Eubank at this stage in his career. I think Ben's a more explosive fighter than Liam Smith, who had Eubank all over the place. Didn't even really catch him clean to get him all over the place. Never been known as much of a puncher. I just think at this stage of his career, Eubank's damaged goods. I think Ben will be strong. I think Eubank will be depleted at that weight and the rehydration clause. I could see Ben taking him out in 3 or 4 rounds, to be honest with you.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate the straightforward prediction.
No
Paul?
messing, mate.
Yeah. Paul, I don't know if you were going to go for Eubank Jr., but you're going to go for Ben now. That's definitely the way I'm starting to starting to lean. But yeah, what is your final, not final prediction? What is your prediction for this fight?
I'm gonna go the other way, make it one apiece. I think Eubank Jr. wins. I actually don't mind Conor Benn. I actually quite like him, but I don't think he's that good. He hasn't beaten everyone. His biggest wins are all far past their best fighters. He arguably hasn't beaten anyone on a British title level. He's fighting at middleweight. Yes, he's more explosive and fresher, but I don't see him as a big puncher. Particularly in those couple of fights he's had since the his period off. Yes, Eubank will be depleted and all of that, but I ultimately think he still has enough to beat Conor Benn, to be honest. I was going to lean towards points, but I don't know. Something's telling me Eubank could stop him, so I'm going to go Eubank to stop Conor Benn in about round 6 or 7.
Fantastic. Look, it's possibly going to be the biggest fight to take place in the UK this year, and it's not for some people, but we will be tuning in, won't we? I'm going to agree with Paul here. Mostly because I look at Ben and I think Ben's actually a relatively not a massive welterweight. So I just think on the night there is the rehydration clause that matters here. And Eubank Jr., I do think he's past his best, but I think I question how Ben will respond to being hit by not a small middleweight in Eubank Jr. So I'm going for Eubank Jr. to stop Conor Benn. I'll go mid rounds as well. So pretty much identical to what Paul's saying, if I'm honest. But we'll see. Look, there could be some twists and turns from now until then. So we'll see what happens. Paul, Danny, thank you both very much for joining me, and I'll speak to both of you again very, very soon.
Cheers, guys. All the best.